Don't sign that. The words cut clean through the glass-walled conference room, soft but undeniable, like a crack forming beneath polished marble. Every head turned. Jonathan Reeves didn't look up at first, his pen hovering above a $120 million contract, irritation tightening his jaw at the interruption. He was a man who controlled rooms, not one who was stopped by them. But then he noticed something unusual. Silence. Not the respectful kind. The kind that holds its breath. Slowly, he lifted his eyes. She stood there in a simple black and white uniform, a tray still balanced in one hand, as if she had forgotten to be afraid. Emily Carter. Just a waitress. At least, that's what everyone thought. 10 minutes earlier, she had moved quietly between tables, refilling glasses, invisible to men in tailored suits and watches worth more than her yearly rent. But Emily wasn't looking at the people. She was watching the details. The slight hesitation when the lead investor spoke. The way his accent slipped for half a second. The faint smudge on the rim of a water glass that didn't belong there. Small things. Always the small things. "Excuse me," Jonathan said, his voice calm but edged, the kind of calm that warned of consequences. "This is a private meeting." A few of the executives shifted uncomfortably, already anticipating what would come next. Security would be called. The interruption would be removed. Order would be restored. That was how his world worked. But Emily didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the contract, on the pen, on his hand. "You shouldn't sign it," she said again, quieter this time, but somehow louder in the stillness. A ripple of disbelief spread across the room. One of the investors let out a short laugh, shaking his head as if this were some kind of misunderstanding. "Jonathan," he said smoothly, "perhaps your staff needs better training." The words were polite. The tone was not. Jonathan finally set the pen down. Not because of her words. Because of her eyes. There was no panic in them. No apology. Just certainty. And certainty, he had learned over decades of building an empire, was never something to ignore. "Why?" he asked, the single word. Shifting the air in the room. Now it wasn't about removing her. It was about understanding her. Emily took one step forward. The tray in her hand trembled slightly, but her voice did not. "Because something's wrong," she said. "And you're the only one about to pay for it." The room stilled again, deeper this time. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretched endlessly, 12 stories below, cars moving like silent currents. Inside, time seemed to slow. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, studying her, measuring her. He had seen confidence before. This was different. This wasn't confidence built on power. It was something quieter, something harder to explain. "Explain," he said. And for the first time, the meeting stopped being his. It became hers. Emily did not rush her words. She placed the tray down on the edge of the table, carefully, as if even the smallest sound mattered. Her eyes moved once across the room, not at the men, but at what they had touched, what they had brought, what they had assumed was invisible. "The man who handed you that contract," she said quietly. "He keeps adjusting his cuff, but not because it is uncomfortable. He is checking something." The investor's smile flickered, just for a fraction of a second. It was small, almost nothing, but Jonathan saw it. And once he saw it, he could not unsee it. The room shifted again. "That is speculation," another executive said, his voice tight, defensive in a way that did not match the situation. Emily nodded slightly, as if she expected that response. "You are right," she said. "On its own, it is nothing." She stepped closer to the table, her gaze lowering to the glass of water near Jonathan's hand. But that glass was replaced 3 minutes ago. Not by staff. By him. Now every eye turned to the glass. Clear. Still. Perfectly ordinary. Jonathan frowned. He had not noticed. He noticed everything. Or at least, he believed he did. "We have security protocols," someone added quickly. "Everything in this room has been cleared." Emily exhaled slowly, steadying herself. This was the moment that always mattered. The moment when truth sounded like doubt. "Then ask him why he touched it," she said. Silence. The kind that stretches too long. The investor gave a light laugh, raising his hand slightly. "This is absurd," he said, smooth again, almost too smooth. "Are we really entertaining this?" But Jonathan did not look at him. He was looking at the glass. Then at Emily. Then back at the man. "Answer the question," Jonathan said. "No anger. Just wait. The kind that does not need to rise to be felt." For the first time, the investor hesitated. It was brief. Most would miss it. Emily did not. Jonathan did not. And in that hesitation, something broke. I adjusted it out of habit, the man replied, his voice still controlled, but no longer effortless. That is all. Emily tilted her head slightly. Then why did you not drink from it? The question landed softly. But it landed. No one spoke. Not immediately. Jonathan's gaze dropped again to the glass, then to the condensation forming along its side, then to the faint mark near the rim that caught the light differently than the rest. Small, almost invisible. His fingers moved toward it, then stopped. He looked back at Emily. What are you suggesting? He asked. This time, his voice was lower. Not dismissive. Careful. Emily met his gaze fully now. I am suggesting, she said, that not everything in this room belongs here. The air tightened. One of the assistants shifted near the door, unsure whether to step forward or stay still. Outside, a distant siren passed through the city, faint and irrelevant, yet somehow perfectly timed. Jonathan leaned back slowly, his mind moving faster than his body. Deals, risks, patterns, anomalies. He had built his life on seeing what others missed. And now, a waitress was forcing him to look again. No one touches anything, he said finally, his voice firm, cutting through the uncertainty. The command changed everything. Phones were set down. Hands withdrew. Eyes sharpened. The meeting was no longer a negotiation. It was a question. And Emily Carter stood at the center of it, no longer invisible, no longer just a waitress, but the only person in the room who had seen the moment before it mattered. No one moved, but everything changed. The air in the room felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were listening. Jonathan Reeves kept his eyes on the glass, but his mind had already moved 3 steps ahead. Patterns, risk, intent. He had built a 9-figure empire by trusting instincts like this. And right now, every instinct was telling him to slow down. Call internal security, he said quietly, not looking away. The assistant near the door hesitated for half a second, then stepped out, the soft click of the door echoing louder than it should have. Across the table, the investor leaned back in his chair, forcing a relaxed posture that did not quite reach his eyes. This is unnecessary, he said, his tone measured, but the ease was gone. You are letting a server derail a legitimate transaction. Jonathan finally looked up. Not sharply, not aggressively, just enough to remind everyone who controlled the room. I am letting a detail speak, he replied. Silence followed, the kind that did not need to be filled. Emily stood still, her hands now resting lightly at her sides. From a distance, she looked calm. Up close, there was the faintest tremor in her fingers. Not fear. Focus. She had seen this moment before. Not this room. Not these people. But this shift. The second when truth begins to surface and no one knows what to do with it. Jonathan noticed it. Not the tremor. The steadiness behind it. What else did you see? He asked. The question surprised everyone. It surprised her too, just slightly. Most people stopped at doubt. Very few asked for more. Emily inhaled slowly, her gaze moving again, retracing the last 10 minutes in her mind. He arrived late, she said, nodding subtly toward the investor. But not rushed. His shoes were dry, even though it started raining 20 minutes before the meeting. A few heads turned instinctively toward the man's shoes. Polished. Immaculate. Out of place. He also never sat fully back in his chair, she continued. He stayed forward, like he was waiting for a moment, not participating in one. The investor let out a soft breath, almost a laugh, but there was strain in it now. Observations, he said. Nothing more. Emily did not respond to him. She was looking at Jonathan. Always at Jonathan. Because in the end, he was the only one who needed to understand. And when he adjusted the glass, she added, her voice lower now. He used his sleeve, not his hand. That landed differently. Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly. Not in anger. In calculation. Why does that matter? One of the executives asked, unable to hold the question back. Emily paused for just a fraction of a second, choosing her words. Because people protect what they touch, she said. Unless they do not want to leave anything behind. The room went still again. Deeper this time. The kind of stillness that does not break easily. Jonathan leaned forward slowly, his gaze returning to the glass, then shifting to the investor, then back again. A pattern was forming. And once a pattern forms, it demands an answer. The door opened quietly as 2 members of internal security stepped inside, their presence subtle, but undeniable. They did not speak. They did not need to. Jonathan gestured slightly toward the table. "Test it," he said. "No hesitation now. No doubt. Just a decision. The kind that defines outcomes." One of the security officers approached, carefully, methodically, removing a small testing device from his jacket. The room watched. Every breath measured. Every second stretched. Emily did not move. She did not look away, because she already knew. And somewhere in the silence, as the device hovered just above the rim of the glass, the truth was no longer a question. It was about to become real. The device hovered just above the rim of the glass, steady, precise, almost indifferent to the tension it had created. No one spoke, not even a breath out of place. Jonathan Reeves watched without blinking, his mind already calculating outcomes, contingencies, consequences. Across the table, the investor's composure held, but barely. His fingers tapped once against the edge of the chair, then stopped, as if he had remembered himself too late. Emily noticed. She always noticed. The security officer adjusted the scanner slightly, angling it toward the faint mark near the rim. A soft beep broke the silence. Then another. Different this time. Sharper. Not an alarm. Not yet. But not normal. The second. Officer stepped closer, his expression tightening just enough to matter. Jonathan saw it. That was all he needed. "Report," he said, his voice low, controlled, leaving no room for interpretation. The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, then answered. "There is a foreign compound present, sir. Not consistent with standard food service materials." The words landed quietly, but they changed everything. No one reacted immediately. The room held still, as if refusing to accept what it had just heard. Then, slowly, the weight settled in. One of the executives leaned back, his chair creaking softly, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Another removed his glasses, wiping them with unnecessary care, buying time, processing. Jonathan did neither. His gaze shifted from the glass to the investor, and this time, there was no question in it. Only clarity. "You want to explain that," he said. It was not a request. The investor smiled. Or tried to. It did not reach his eyes. "Contamination happens," he replied smoothly, but the smoothness was cracking now, thin at the edges. "This is a building with hundreds of people moving through it every day." Jonathan leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table, the posture calm, almost casual, but unmistakably final. "Then you will not mind if we test everything else you brought into this room," he said. Another pause, longer this time. The investor's eyes flickered, not to Jonathan, not to the glass, but to the briefcase at his side. It was quick, almost invisible, but Emily saw it, and Jonathan followed it. That was the moment the balance shifted completely. The room no longer belonged to the deal. It belonged to the truth. The second security officer stepped toward the briefcase without being asked. The investor straightened, his voice sharpening for the first time. "That is private property." Jonathan did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "So is my life," he replied. Silence again. Heavy. Unavoidable. The officer paused, waiting for a signal. Jonathan gave a small nod. Permission. The briefcase was placed on the table, the latches opening with a soft click that seemed to echo through the entire floor. Inside, neatly arranged documents, a tablet, and a sealed container no one had mentioned before. Emily's gaze fixed on it immediately. Not fear. Recognition. The officer reached for it carefully, scanning again. The same sharp tone. Clear now. Undeniable. The truth was no longer forming. It was here. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving the container, then lifting once more to Emily. For a brief second, everything else disappeared. The suits. The deal. The risk. There was only one fact that mattered. She had seen it first. And in a room full of power, she had been the only one paying attention. No one reached for the container at first. It sat there in the open briefcase, small, sealed, almost unremarkable, yet now it carried the weight of every unspoken fear in the room. Jonathan Reeves kept his gaze steady, but something inside him had shifted. Not panic, not even anger, just a quiet recalibration of trust. "Open it," he said. The words were simple, but they carried finality. The security officer hesitated, not out of fear, but out of precision. Every movement now mattered. Carefully, he adjusted his gloves, then reached forward, breaking the seal with controlled pressure. A faint click. The lid lifted. Inside, a compact vial rested in a molded slot, clear, colorless, almost identical to water. But nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. The scanner moved again, hovering closer this time. The tone that followed was immediate. Sharp. Certain. The second officer stepped in, his voice lower now, measured. "This is not a food-related substance," he said. "It is specialized. It does not belong in this environment." That was enough. The room reacted, not with chaos, but with a tightening silence that pressed in from all sides. One of the executives stood up abruptly, then stopped, unsure where to go or what to do. Another reached for his phone, then slowly set it back down, as if even that action required permission now. Jonathan did not move. His eyes shifted to the investor again, and this time, there was no distance left between question and conclusion. "You planned this," he said. The statement did not need emphasis. The investor exhaled. Slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, as if something inside him had decided the effort was no longer worth it. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he smiled. Not the polished smile from before. Something quieter, colder. "I planned an opportunity," he replied. The words were careful, chosen, but stripped of pretense. "You were going to sign without looking twice." Everyone in this room was. No one interrupted him now, not even Jonathan, because it was true. That was the part that settled the deepest. Emily watched from the edge of the table, her posture still, her expression unreadable, but her eyes never left the man. She had seen this before. The moment when control slips and honesty, however twisted, steps in to take its place. "You rely on patterns," the investor continued softly. "Routine, trust in systems. People like me, we study those patterns." Jonathan leaned back slightly, absorbing every word, not as an accusation, but as data. He had spent his life understanding risk. But risk evolves. It always does. "And you thought no one would notice," Jonathan said. The investor's gaze flickered, just once, toward Emily. "I thought the right people would not," he answered. Silence followed again. Not confusion this time. Understanding. Jonathan turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting Emily's fully for the first time since the room had changed. There was no dismissal in that look now. No hierarchy. Just recognition. "But she did," Jonathan said quietly. The weight of those words settled over the room, shifting something deeper than the situation itself. Not just what had happened, but who had seen it. The security officers stepped forward then, calm, controlled, taking position without disruption, the kind of presence that closes a chapter without needing to announce it. The investor did not resist. He did not need to. The outcome had already been decided the moment a waitress chose to speak. Jonathan remained seated, his hands resting lightly on the table, his gaze drifting once more to the glass, the contract, the pen. Small things. Always the small things. And then, slowly, he stood, not to assert power, but to acknowledge something he had nearly missed, something that had been there all along, unnoticed, until it mattered most. Jonathan Reeves did not speak immediately after standing. He let the silence settle, not as a pause, but as a reset. Around him, the room slowly exhaled, tension loosening in small, almost invisible ways. Chairs shifted, eyes dropped. The presence of security was no longer the focus. The truth was, and it had already done its work. Jonathan's gaze moved once more across the table, but this time, he was not studying contracts or investors. He was studying people who had spoken, who had stayed quiet, who had noticed nothing, and who had noticed everything. His eyes stopped on Emily. She had stepped back slightly, as if trying to return to the edges of the room, to where she had been before any of this began. Invisible. Safe. But something had changed. Not just in the room. In the way she stood. In the way everyone now saw her. "What is your name?" Jonathan asked. The question was simple, but it carried weight. It shifted attention. Not to power, but to recognition. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second. Not because she did not know the answer, but because she was not used to being asked. "Emily Carter," she said quietly. Jonathan nodded once, as if committing it to memory, not as a formality, but as something that mattered. "Emily Carter," he repeated, slower this time. The room listened. Because when a man like Jonathan Reeves repeats a name, it becomes something else. Not just a label. A marker. A moment. "You saved this room," he said. No exaggeration. No performance. Just a statement. Some of the executives shifted again, this time with something closer to discomfort. Not from the situation, from the realization. They had all been here. They had all seen the same things. And they had all missed it. Emily shook her head slightly. I just noticed something, she replied. The words were soft, almost dismissive, as if she were trying to shrink the moment back down to something manageable. Jonathan studied her for a second longer. There was no pride in her voice. No attempt to claim importance. Just truth. And that, more than anything else, made it real. Most people do not. He said. The sentence lingered. Not as praise. As fact. One of the executives cleared his throat, stepping forward carefully, as if unsure how to enter a conversation that had already moved beyond him. Sir, should we continue the meeting? He asked. The question sounded strange now, almost misplaced, like a script that no longer fit the scene. Jonathan did not answer immediately. He looked at the contract still resting on the table, the pen beside it, the glass that had started everything. Then he shook his head once. No, he said. We do not continue something that was built on a blind spot. The words landed heavier than anything that had come before, because they were not about the meeting. They were about everything. Systems, habits, assumptions, the quiet belief that control meant awareness. Emily lowered her gaze slightly, not out of discomfort, but out of habit. She was used to stepping back when things became important, used to letting others take the space. Jonathan noticed. Wait, he said, before she could move any further. She stopped, not fully turning, just enough to listen. He walked around the table slowly, not rushed, not dramatic, until he stood a few feet away from her, close enough now that the distance between them was no longer defined by roles. Why did you speak? He asked. It was not a challenge. It was curiosity, real curiosity. Emily looked at him for a moment, then past him, as if searching for something that was not in the room. Because no one else did, she said. The answer was simple, but it carried everything. Jonathan held her gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod. Not approval, understanding. And in that quiet exchange, something shifted again. Not power, not control, perspective. The kind that does not announce itself. The kind that stays long after the room empties. The room did not return to normal. It shifted into something quieter, more aware, as if every person inside had been forced to see a version of themselves they had ignored. Papers were gathered slowly. Chairs slid back with care instead of confidence. Conversations, if they happened at all, were low and uncertain. Jonathan Reeves remained where he was, standing near the head of the table, but no longer commanding it. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about the next deal, the next move, the next advantage. He was thinking about a moment. A single moment where everything could have gone unnoticed. His gaze moved again to the glass, now removed from the table, sealed, handled with caution. Such a small thing. Something he would have dismissed without a second thought just an hour ago. He let out a slow breath, not out of relief, but recognition. Systems fail quietly. Assumptions fail silently. And sometimes, the only thing that stands between order and consequence is someone who is not supposed to matter. Across the room, Emily had already begun to move again, picking up the tray she had set down earlier, her motions careful, almost automatic. She was returning to her role, back to the edges, back to invisibility. It was what she knew, what she had always known. Jonathan watched her for a moment, noticing how easily she stepped out of the center, as if she had never been there at all. That, more than anything, unsettled him. Not what she had done, but how quickly the world expected her to disappear afterward. Emily, he called, his voice not raised, but it carried. She stopped again, turning slightly, her posture composed, waiting, not expecting anything, just ready to listen. Jonathan walked toward her, not with urgency, but with intention. The distance between them closed slowly, measured in quiet steps rather than authority. You said you noticed, he began, his tone thoughtful now, almost reflective. You saw patterns that no one else did. Emily held his gaze, but there was no anticipation in her expression. No sense that this conversation would change anything. I pay attention, she replied simply. Jonathan gave a faint nod. That is not a common skill, he said. A few people nearby glanced toward them, listening without meaning to. Because this was no longer just a conversation. It was a shift in how the room defined value. Emily adjusted her grip on the tray slightly, grounding herself in something familiar. It is not a skill, she said quietly. It is what happens when you are used to being overlooked. The words landed with a different kind of weight. Not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. Jonathan's expression changed, just slightly. Not surprise. Understanding. A deeper kind. One that does not come from information, but from realization. He looked around the room briefly, at the executives, the assistants, the polished surfaces and controlled environments that had always operated under his direction. Then he looked back at her. You see more because no one is looking at you, he said. Emily did not answer. She did not need to. The truth had already settled between them. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing just enough to show the shift. That is not where you belong, he said. The statement was quiet, but firm. Not a suggestion, not an offer, a recognition. Emily's fingers tightened slightly around the tray, the only sign that the words had reached deeper than she expected. This is my job, she replied, not defensive, just honest. Jonathan nodded once. It is what you do, he said, not who you are. Silence followed again, but this time it was different. Not tension, possibility, something unspoken, waiting. And for the first time since the room had changed, Emily did not step back. She stayed exactly where she was, standing in the space she had created, even if she did not fully understand it yet. The room had begun to empty, but not in the way it usually did after a meeting. There was no rush to the next call, no confident strides toward elevators and waiting schedules. People moved slower, quieter, as if each step required a second thought. Jonathan Reeves remained where he was, standing just a few feet from Emily, the distance between them no longer defined by roles, but by something less visible and far more important. Where did you learn to see like that? He asked, his voice lower now, stripped of authority, almost personal. It was not a question he asked often, and when he did, it was never without reason. Emily did not answer immediately. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the window, where the city stretched out in layers of glass and motion, then back to him. I did not learn it, she said. I needed it. The words were quiet, but they carried a weight that did not belong to this room. Jonathan noticed that. He noticed the way her voice did not seek attention, but held truth anyway. Needed it for what? He asked. Emily shifted her grip on the tray again, a small movement, grounding, familiar. To avoid mistakes, she said. The kind that do not give you a second chance. Jonathan studied her, not just listening to the words, but to everything behind them. There was no exaggeration, no attempt to impress, just a line drawn from experience to instinct. You have seen something like this before, he said. Not a guess, a conclusion. Emily met his gaze, and for a moment, the quiet steadiness in her eyes deepened. Not exactly this, she replied, but close enough to recognize the pattern. Around them, the last few people exited the room, the soft click of the door marking the end of something that had started as a transaction and ended as a realization. The long table stood empty now, except for the space where the briefcase had been, the faint outline of where everything had shifted. Jonathan glanced at it briefly, then back at her. Most people ignore patterns until it is too late, he said. Emily nodded once. Most people are taught to, she answered. That made him pause. Not because it was unexpected, because it was accurate. Systems were built to move forward, not to question every detail. Efficiency required trust, and trust, sometimes, required blindness. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his gaze softening just slightly. And you were not, he said. Emily gave the smallest hint of a smile. Not pride, not satisfaction, just acknowledgement. I did not have that luxury, she said. Silence settled again, but this time it felt different. Not heavy, not tense, just clear, like the air after something has been understood. Jonathan took a step back, not retreating, but creating space, as if recognizing that this moment did not belong entirely to him. You should not be carrying trays in a room like this, he said. The statement was simple, but it carried more than it seemed. It was not about status. It was about alignment. Emily looked down briefly at the tray in her hands, then back, up at him. For a second, something flickered in her expression. Not doubt, not resistance, something closer to uncertainty. It is honest work, she said. Jonathan nodded immediately. I know, he replied. That is not the point. The words hung between them, unfinished, but understood. Because for the first time, the conversation was no longer about what had happened. It was about what came next. And neither of them said it out loud. Not yet. The room was almost empty now. The long table stood silent, the chairs neatly pushed in, the glass walls reflecting a version of the meeting that no longer existed. Jonathan Reeves walked slowly back toward the head of the table, his fingers brushing lightly against the surface, as if tracing something invisible that had just changed. Behind him, Emily had not moved. She still held the tray, but not as tightly as before, not as if it defined her place anymore. The distance between who she was and what she did had finally been seen. Jonathan stopped, then turned back to her. For a moment, he said nothing, not because he did not have words, but because he understood the weight they would carry. "Come here," he said quietly. It was not an order. It was an invitation. Emily hesitated, just slightly, then stepped forward. One step, then another. The sound of her shoes against the floor was soft, but clear, measured, present. She stopped a few feet away, close enough now that there was no room left for assumptions. Jonathan reached into his jacket and pulled out a simple business card. No flourish, no presentation, just a small, deliberate motion. He placed it on the table between them. "I do not offer this lightly," he said. His voice was steady, but there was something different beneath it now. Not authority, respect. "But I do not ignore what I cannot explain either." Emily looked at the card, then at him, her expression calm, but thoughtful. She did not reach for it. Not immediately. Jonathan noticed. He expected nothing less. "You see patterns," he continued. "You read rooms. You notice what others miss." He paused, just long enough for the words to settle. "That is not service work. That is strategy." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something unspoken, something forming between them that did not need to be rushed. Emily lowered her gaze again, but this time it was not to step away. It was to consider. Her fingers shifted slightly on the tray, then loosened. Slowly, she set it down on the table. The sound was soft, final. When she looked back up, there was a change. Subtle, but undeniable. "What happens if I say no?" she asked. The question was quiet, but direct. Jonathan did not hesitate. "Then you go back to what you were doing," he said. "And I go back to wondering how many things I have missed." The honesty of it landed differently than any offer could have. No pressure, no promise, just truth. Emily looked at the card again. Then, finally, she reached for it. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge the moment. She turned it over once in her hand, reading the name she already knew, the number she had never expected to hold. Jonathan watched, but he did not interrupt. Because this was not his decision. It never was. Emily slipped the card into the pocket of her uniform, her movement small, almost invisible, but it changed everything. Not because of what it meant now, but because of what it might mean later. She picked up the tray again, but it felt different in her hands. Lighter. Or maybe she was. Jonathan gave a slight nod, not as approval, but as recognition. "Pay attention to the small things," he said, echoing something she had already lived by. Emily met his gaze, just for a second, then gave the faintest hint of a smile. Not for him, not for the moment, but for what she understood now. Then she turned and walked toward the door, her steps steady, unhurried, leaving behind a room that would never quite see things the same way again. Jonathan remained where he was, his eyes following her until the door closed softly behind her. And in the quiet that followed, he finally understood something that had nothing to do with business. Sometimes, the difference between control and consequence is not power. It is attention.